The sonar screen lit up at 2:47 in the morning. The technician on duty later said he thought the equipment had malfunctioned because what he was looking at was simply not possible. A return signal stretching nearly 400 meters across, moving at depth off the coast of Oregon. Then, 11 seconds later, nothing. The signal was gone as completely as if it had never existed. Information from internet sources, links in description. Subscribe. Let's begin. The Pacific Ocean off the Oregon coast is not a friendly place. It never has been. The waters there plunge into the Cascadia Basin, a geological trench system that drops to depths of nearly 3,000 meters in places. Imagine stacking 10 Empire State Buildings on top of each other, and you still wouldn't reach the bottom. The currents are cold, unpredictable, and thick with biomass that has confused sonar operators for decades. Strange things happen out there. Strange things have always happened out there. But what the research vessel team picked up that night in the winter survey window was different, and the people involved have spent years trying to explain it. The vessel in question was conducting a routine deepwater acoustic mapping survey, part of an ongoing NOAA-affiliated project cataloging seafloor topology along the Cascadia subduction zone. You have to understand what that zone is to appreciate why people were out there at all. The Cascadia subduction zone is one of the most seismically volatile geological features in the Western Hemisphere, a place where the Juan de Fuca tectonic plate is grinding beneath the North American plate at a rate of about 4 centimeters per year. That sounds slow. It isn't. Geologists have described it as a coiled spring that has been loading tension for over 300 years, and when it releases, the resulting megathrust earthquake could be magnitude 9 or higher. Think about that. The last time it fully ruptured, in January 1700, the earthquake was so powerful it sent a tsunami all the way across the Pacific to Japan. People there recorded it in historical documents. The Pacific Northwest coast was essentially reset. So yes, there are very good scientific reasons to have research vessels sitting above that abyss with their sonar arrays running. And there are very good reasons why the people doing that work pay extremely close attention to their instruments. The team aboard that vessel numbered 11 people, a mix of oceanographic researchers, marine biologists, and acoustic technicians contracted through a Pacific Northwest University research program. The lead acoustic technician, whose name has been kept out of public reporting at his own request, was not on active watch at the moment of detection. He was asleep. The person at the console was a junior researcher, only 18 months into her fieldwork career, and she almost didn't report what she saw. Almost. Here is what the sonar data showed, and pay close attention because these numbers matter. The multi-beam echo sounder they were operating is a sophisticated piece of equipment capable of detecting objects and density variations at significant depth. At 2:47 a.m. local time, it registered an acoustic return consistent with a large, coherent object. Not dispersed biomass, not a thermal layer, not a geological feature, something with a defined edge. The return measured approximately 380 meters in its longest dimension. To give you a sense of scale, the Eiffel Tower is 330 meters tall. What the sonar found, if it was a solid object, was longer than the Eiffel Tower laid on its side. It was moving. Not fast, but moving. The acoustic return held for approximately 11 seconds before it disappeared. Not faded, not drifted out of range, but vanished from the display with a completeness that the technician later described as like someone turned off a light. In 11 seconds, at the estimated depth of the return, the object had moved what preliminary calculations suggested was between 40 and 60 meters. That is roughly the length of a standard Olympic swimming pool, in 11 seconds, at depth. The junior researcher stared at her screen for what she described as probably 30 seconds that felt like 10 minutes. Then she called the lead technician. He looked at the logged data. He ran a diagnostic on the equipment. He looked at the data again. Then he woke up the expedition's chief scientist. What happened next is where this story gets genuinely fascinating, and where the official and unofficial accounts begin to diverge in ways that are uncomfortable to ignore. The chief scientist, according to the internal expedition log that was later partially obtained through a records request, ordered a second pass. The vessel altered its heading and ran the sonar array back over the same coordinates. They found nothing. The seafloor returned a completely normal profile, the rocky, irregular terrain typical of the Cascadia Basin. No anomaly, no object, no explanation for what the sonar had captured 9 minutes earlier. Now, the official interpretation entered the picture almost immediately. Sonar data, especially in deep ocean environments, is notoriously susceptible to what researchers call acoustic artifacts. Phantom returns generated by thermal gradients, by bioluminescent layers of organisms dense enough to reflect sound, by underwater currents creating pressure differentials that mimic solid objects. The ocean plays tricks. It does this constantly. Deep-sea sonar operators have cataloged thousands of false returns that turned out to be schools of fish, bubble plumes from hydrothermal vents, or simply the equipment doing what electronics do, occasionally misbehaving. Imagine you are that chief scientist. You have a junior researcher who has just woken you up at 3 in the morning to show you 11 seconds of anomalous data from a piece of equipment operating in one of the most acoustically complex underwater environments on Earth. What do you write in the log? You write, "Instrument artifact, possible biological layer, no further action required." Because that is the rational thing to do. That is science being responsible. And maybe that is exactly what it was. Maybe. But here is the thing that the lead technician could not let go of, and which he eventually shared with colleagues outside the expedition, and which is why this story exists at all. The acoustic signature of that return was not consistent with a biological layer. He had been running deep-water sonar for 11 years by that point. He had seen every variety of false return that the Pacific Ocean could manufacture. Dense schools of mesopelagic fish, the lanternfish and hatchetfish that live at mid-depths and scatter sound in ways that can fool equipment. They produce diffuse, soft-edged returns that bloom and shift. Thermal layers produce horizontal bands. Bubble plumes from vents produce vertical columns. What he saw on that screen had hard edges. It had a consistent acoustic density across its entire width. It did not behave like biology, and it did not behave like geology. It behaved, he said, like something solid. This is exactly where the story takes an unexpected turn, because he is not the only person who has reported something like this off the Oregon coast. The Pacific Northwest Deepwater Zone has an unusual and largely unreported history of acoustic anomalies that have accumulated quietly in research logs, in personal accounts from commercial fishing crews, and in the records of the U.S. Navy's SOSUS network, the Sound Surveillance System, a Cold War-era network of hydrophone arrays planted on the ocean floor across the Pacific and Atlantic that was originally designed to track Soviet submarines. SOSUS was declassified, at least partially, in the 1990s. What came out of that declassification included something called the bloop. You may have heard of the bloop. In 1997, NOAA hydrophone arrays picked up an ultra-low-frequency acoustic signal in the South Pacific that was extraordinarily powerful, loud enough to be detected by sensors nearly 5,000 kilometers apart. That is the distance from New York to London. The signal had characteristics consistent with a living organism, but to generate that volume of sound, the organism would need to be significantly larger than a blue whale. The scientific consensus eventually settled on a more mundane explanation: icequake, the sound of Antarctic ice fracturing. Case closed, officially. But the SOSUS data from Pacific Northwest waters in the years before and after that Oregon survey contains returns that researchers in the acoustic oceanography community discuss carefully in private and rarely in print. One of those researchers, speaking at an informal seminar at a Pacific Northwest university, a seminar that was not recorded and the details of which reached the public through the notes of an attendee, described a pattern. Not a single anomalous return, but a recurring pattern of deep water acoustic events in a specific corridor of the Cascadia Basin that did not match any cataloged natural or man-made source. Think about what that means. Not one incident, a pattern. The corridor in question runs roughly parallel to the continental shelf break, the point where the seafloor drops away from the relatively shallow coastal shelf into the true deep ocean. This is already a biologically significant zone. Upwelling currents along the Oregon coast bring cold, nutrient-rich water to the surface, supporting one of the most productive marine ecosystems in the North Pacific. Gray whales migrate through it. Humpbacks feed there. Sperm whales hunt in the deeper water below. The deep zones of this corridor are also home to species that most people have never heard of. Giant squid, of course, but also the bigfin squid, with its extraordinary elongated arms that can reach lengths of 8 meters, and the less publicized but genuinely unsettling deep-sea species that surface trawls occasionally bring up dead and are quietly logged and rarely discussed publicly. It seems that when you operate sonar in genuinely deep water, you encounter things that do not fit neatly into existing categories. The question is what you do with that information. What the Oregon survey team did, officially, was nothing. The expedition concluded. The data was filed. The acoustic anomaly was logged as an artifact. The junior researcher moved on to other fieldwork. The chief scientist published 3 papers from that expedition, none of which mentioned the incident. But the lead technician kept a copy of the raw data. That is not unusual. Researchers often archive their own working files. What is slightly more unusual is that he shared those files 2 years later with a former colleague who had moved into a position with a private oceanographic research company with contracts that included, among other things, work for the United States Navy. What happened to those files after that is not entirely clear. What is clear is that 6 months after they were shared, there was renewed interest in acoustic survey work in the Cascadia Basin. Not through NOAA, not through a university program, through a contractor. And this is where you need to hold that thought, because the contractor's story and what their survey equipment found and what was done with that information pulls this entire account into territory that is significantly stranger than a single anomalous sonar return in the middle of the night. The ocean does not give up its secrets easily. It never has. 71% of this planet's surface is covered by water, and the deep ocean floor, below 1,000 meters, below the light, below the thermocline layers that insulate the abyss from the surface world, remains less mapped than the surface of Mars. We have sent rovers to another planet. We have better charts of lunar craters than we do of vast stretches of the Pacific seafloor. And in that unmapped dark, at pressures that would crush an unprotected human body in seconds, in temperatures just above freezing, in total and absolute blackness, something is moving. The contractor was a company called Pacific Depth Solutions. That name will not appear in any headline, and you will not find a press release about their Cascadia Basin work, because what they do exists in the comfortable gray zone between academic research and defense contracting that the oceanographic world has quietly tolerated for decades. They build equipment, they run surveys, they file reports with clients who are not required to make those reports public. And in the spring, roughly 14 months after the original anomaly was detected, they deployed a towed array sonar system in the same corridor of the Cascadia Basin that the university team had been mapping. A towed array is a different instrument from the multi-beam echo sounder on the research vessel, where a multi-beam system fires sound pulses downward and maps the seafloor directly below. A towed array is a long cable, sometimes hundreds of meters long, lined with hydrophones, that trails behind the vessel and listens.
Passively. It does not send a signal, it receives. And what it receives in deep water can be extraordinary in its detail and its range. The U.S. Navy has used towed arrays for submarine detection since the 1960s. They are sensitive enough to detect a submarine's propeller cavitation from hundreds of kilometers away. They can hear the difference between a blue whale and a fin whale based on the frequency signature of their calls alone. What Pacific Depth Solutions towed array heard in the Cascadia corridor on the fourth night of their survey deployment was described in a summary document. A document that was not intended to leave the company, but did, as a non-biological, non-geological acoustic event of significant amplitude and unusual frequency characteristics. That is the sanitized version. The person who saw the raw data before it was summarized described it differently. They said it sounded, when played back through speakers at audible frequency, like a very slow, very deep exhalation. A rhythm. Not mechanical. Not the cyclic thrum of a ship's engine or the steady pulse of industrial equipment. Something that varied. Something that breathed. Imagine sitting in a dark room, listening to a recording from 3 kilometers below the surface of the Pacific Ocean, and hearing something that sounds like it is breathing. Now, before reasonable skepticism is abandoned entirely, the scientific framework for this kind of data needs to be clear. Low-frequency biological sounds in the deep ocean are not rare. Baleen whales produce calls in the 10 to 40 Hz range that travel enormous distances. Some whale calls have been detected over 4,000 kilometers from their source. The ocean is, acoustically, a crowded and bizarre place, and sounds travel through it in ways that seem to violate intuition, ducting along thermal layers, bouncing off the seafloor, arriving from directions that have nothing to do with the actual source location. A sound detected in the Cascadia Basin could theoretically originate hundreds of kilometers away and arrive from an entirely misleading direction. The acoustic analysts at Pacific Depth Solutions knew this. They accounted for it. What made the Cascadia recording unusual was not simply its character, but its localization. The towed array, by processing the time delay between hydrophone elements along its length, can calculate the direction and approximate distance of a sound source with considerable precision. The source of the recording was not hundreds of kilometers away. It was localized to a region of water column directly above a section of seafloor at approximately 2,200 meters depth, within the Cascadia Basin, in a location roughly 40 kilometers from where the original sonar anomaly had been detected 14 months earlier. Think about what that means in terms of geography.
40 kilometers. The distance you might commute to work. In ocean terms, that is nothing. That is the same neighborhood. But this is where it gets truly interesting. Because the Pacific Depth Solutions Survey did something the original university team could not. They had the time, the equipment, and presumably the budget to investigate. They ran the towed array in a slow circle around the localized source region, building up a three-dimensional acoustic picture of the water column. And in that picture, at a depth of between 1,800 and 2,200 meters, they found a zone of acoustic opacity. Acoustic opacity means sound is not passing through a region the way it should. Something is absorbing or deflecting the acoustic energy. It can be caused by a density anomaly in the water, a bubble plume, a halocline layer, a mass of organisms. But the shape of this opacity was not consistent with any of those natural explanations. It was not a horizontal layer. It was not a vertical column. It was roughly ovoid.
Roughly. And the qualifier matters because sonar reconstruction of three-dimensional shapes in open water is not an exact science. But roughly ovoid, roughly contained. And it was, across multiple passes of the array over approximately 6 hours, in the same location. It was sitting there. You have to pause and sit with that. Something roughly 300 to 400 meters in its longest dimension, acoustically opaque, in the middle of the water column. Not on the seafloor, not at the surface, suspended at mid-depth. And it stayed in essentially the same position for 6 hours of observation. In a current. In the open ocean. Objects do not do that. Freely floating objects in ocean currents drift. They move. Maintaining a stable position in open water against current requires either active propulsion or attachment to the seafloor. The seafloor at that location, according to the survey data, showed no structure that could account for a tethered object. There was no artificial installation, no geological feature of the right dimensions. Nothing. The summary document concluded with language that was careful to the point of being almost useless. It noted the acoustic anomalies, flagged them for further analysis, and recommended additional survey work. What it did not do was propose a hypothesis. The author of that summary later said that they had been specifically instructed not to propose one. The client wanted data. The client would draw their own conclusions. And now the most unsettling detail. The client, based on the contract documentation that accompanied the leaked summary, was not a commercial entity. It was not an energy company doing subsea infrastructure work. The contract routing, following the chain of subcontractors and program offices, led back to the Office of Naval Research. The United States Navy has known about this. How long they have known, what they believe they are dealing with, and what actions, if any, they have taken, are questions that exist in a documentary record that is either classified, compartmentalized, or simply not yet accessible. FOIA requests related to Cascadia Basin acoustic survey work in the relevant time periods have returned either heavily redacted documents or responses indicating that no responsive records exist. That second category is interesting. No responsive records exist can mean exactly what it says. It can also mean that the records exist under a classification level or program designation that falls outside the scope of the request. These are not the same thing, and experienced researchers in the national security transparency space know the difference. What is publicly documented through NOAA records and published academic literature is that the Cascadia subduction zone has been the subject of an unusual density of acoustic monitoring work in the past decade. Hydrophone networks, autonomous underwater vehicle deployments, ocean bottom seismometer arrays that, while officially intended to monitor earthquake activity, are sensitive to a far broader range of acoustic signals than seismic events alone. The infrastructure for listening is in place. It has been expanding.
Someone is paying attention to what that zone sounds like, systematically and persistently. It seems strange, does it not, that so much listening is happening in a place where the official position is that nothing unusual has been heard. The lead acoustic technician from the original university survey eventually left oceanographic research. He works now in an entirely different field. He has given two informal accounts of that night, one to a colleague, one to a journalist who chose not to publish the story, and his description has been consistent across both. He does not claim to know what the sonar return was. He is careful about that.
He says only that it was real, that it was large, that it moved, and that the explanation he was asked to accept did not fit the data he actually had in front of him. That is a modest claim. It is also, if you think about it, a significant one. A trained professional with 11 years of experience, looking at his own instruments in real time, saying, "This is not what I know, this is something else." The ocean has offered us that moment before. In 1960, the bathyscaphe Trieste descended to the deepest point in the Mariana Trench, nearly 11,000 meters, a place where the pressure reaches over 1,000 times what you experience standing at sea level. The crew reported seeing a flatfish on the seafloor at that depth. That observation was later disputed, questioned, and quietly set aside, because nothing was supposed to survive at that pressure. Decades later, researchers found not only organisms, but entire ecosystems at those depths. Creatures adapted to conditions that should be impossible for life. The ocean kept its secret until we had the tools and, crucially, the willingness to believe what we were seeing. We do not know what lives at depth in the Cascadia Basin. We know that the giant squid, an animal that reaches 15 meters in length and was considered by many scientists to be mythology until the early 20th century, hunts those waters. We know that sperm whales dive to extreme depths to hunt prey that we have never directly observed. The evidence is in the squid beaks found in whale stomachs, some of them from animals whose size we can only estimate by the scale of the beak. There are things down there that eat prey we cannot account for. Something is at the top of a food chain we cannot fully see. And once, at 2:47 in the morning, a sonar return appeared on a screen for 11 seconds, 400 meters wide, 3 kilometers down, moving through the dark. And then it was gone. The Pacific is patient. It has been keeping its secrets for longer than humans have had language to ask questions. Every instrument we lower into that water, every hydrophone array we plant on that seafloor, every acoustic survey we run along that continental shelf, is us asking the same question in different frequencies over and over. The question is simple. The answer, when it finally comes, may not be, what is down there? And perhaps the more pressing question, the one that the existence of that contractor report, that Navy connection, that expanding grid of hydrophones actually forces us to ask, is this: do the people in the position to know the answer already have it? Are they listening not to find something, but to keep track of something they already found? That possibility sits in the deep water of this story, the same way that acoustic return sat in the Cascadia Basin, unresolved, present, and not going away. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next time.